Most people picture Fifth Avenue as a corridor of marble staircases and glittering ballrooms, where chandeliers glowed late into the night and orchestras played for America's richest families. But above those ceilings, beyond carved cornices and gilded mirrors, 2,000 maids slept in narrow attic rooms no guest ever saw. In Newport, in the year 1895 alone, more than 2,287 servants made up nearly 10% of the city's population. For 60 years, an invisible army lived under the roofs of the grandest homes in the nation. How did the most beautiful houses in America hide such relentless labor just a few floors above the silk? Chapter 1. The Dream Built on Servants. In the 1890s, the richest families in America competed not only in size of mansion, but in number of staff. When Cornelius Vanderbilt II completed his Fifth Avenue chateau in 1883, the limestone palace stretched 130 feet along 57th Street. Guests marveled at the carved oak panels imported from a French chateau, the Caen stone facade that mimicked royal residences across the Atlantic, and the two-story Great Hall lined with tapestries that once hung in European castles. But the true measure of the Vanderbilt fortune was never recorded in architectural journals or society columns. It lived in the census records, payroll ledgers, and cramped attic bedrooms that most visitors never glimpsed. 30 servants worked indoors alone. Another dozen tended the stables, the grounds, and the coal furnaces that heated 50 rooms through winter. The number was not unusual. It was expected. Wealth in the Gilded Age demanded visibility. Families built larger, higher, more ornate. They installed marble from Italy, bronze from France, silk from China. But architectural grandeur was only half the equation. The other half was human. Every chandelier required someone to polish its crystals. Every 14-course dinner required someone to serve it, someone to cook it, someone to carry it up narrow service stairs, and someone to scrub the dishes afterward in basement sculleries lit by gaslight. The beauty guests admired was not self-sustaining. It was a performance that required an army of unseen stagehands working in constant motion behind painted flats and velvet curtains. In Newport understood this better than anywhere else in America. The summer colony of Gilded Age industrialists transformed a quiet Rhode Island seacoast town into the most concentrated display of wealth the nation had ever seen. Between 1880 and 1900, families with names like Vanderbilt, Astor, and Belmont erected what they called cottages. The term was ironic. These were not cottages. They were palaces dressed in shingles and stone, sprawling across manicured lawns overlooking the Atlantic. The breakers alone contained 70 rooms. Marble House required 33,000 cubic feet of marble. Rosecliff was modeled after the Grand Trianon at Versailles, but architecture was just the shell. The real machinery was human. In 1895, Newport's population stood at 19,384 residents. Of those, the 2,287 were classified as domestic servants in the federal census. That was nearly 12% of every man, woman, and child counted that summer. The ratio reveals the underlying structure of Gilded Age wealth. For every family living in leisure, another dozen worked in shadow to sustain it. The houses were designed not just to display beauty, but to conceal labor. Servants entered through side doors, climbed back staircases, and moved through narrow service corridors hidden behind wallpapered panels, and slept in rooms no guest would ever tour. The architecture enforced the separation. It had to. The illusion of effortless grandeur depended on making effort invisible. The Vanderbilts were not cruel. Neither were the Astors or Belmonts. They were participants in a system so widely accepted that questioning it seemed absurd. Employing 30 or 40 servants was not extravagance. It was necessity. A Fifth Avenue mansion required round-the-clock labor simply to function. Without staff, the coal furnaces went cold. The gas lights remained unlit. The floors grew dusty. The kitchens fell silent. The entire structure, with all its marble and mahogany and silk, became unlivable. Wealth was not static. It was a perpetual motion machine fueled by wages, schedules, and strict hierarchies that kept the gears turning day and night. The families who built these houses understood this instinctively. They invested in architecture not just as display, but as infrastructure. The servant quarters were planned as carefully as the ballrooms. Attic floors were subdivided into narrow bedrooms, 6 feet by 8 feet, with just enough space for an iron bed, a washstand, and a single chair. Bathrooms were shared among a dozen people. Windows were small, positioned high on gabled walls to let in light, but prevent servants from being seen from the street. The design was functional, not comfortable. It had to be. The goal was efficiency, not hospitality. What kind of life did this system create for the 2,287 people who lived it? That question would haunt the mansions long after the last servant climbed the attic stairs for the final time. Chapter 2: Marble below, heat above. While guests admired imported stone and carved ceilings, another world baked just beneath the roof. The architecture of a Gilded Age mansion was a vertical hierarchy written in brick, plaster, and wood. Descend from the street entrance into the mansion, and the sequence unfolds with precision. First, the public floors. The grand entrance hall, 2 stories tall, paved in marble. The drawing room with silk wallpaper. The library with leather-bound volumes. The dining room where 16 guests could sit beneath a chandelier weighing half a ton. These rooms occupied the prime real estate, the first and second floors, where ceilings soared 12 to 14 feet high and windows stretched from floor to cornice. Then came the family floors. Bedrooms, dressing rooms, private sitting rooms. Still elegant, but smaller. Ceilings dropped to 10 feet. Windows narrowed. The rooms were comfortable, but less theatrical. They did not need to impress. Finally, the servant floors. The 3rd floor, sometimes the 4th, in ceilings barely 7 feet high. Narrow hallways lit by single bulbs. Walls painted in cheap whitewash instead of silk or damask. The rooms here were not designed to be seen, so they were not designed to be beautiful. Heat was the first cruelty. In summer, Newport reached 90 degrees by midday. The ocean breeze cooled the drawing rooms and verandas below, but attic rooms, tucked directly beneath slate roofs, became ovens. Temperatures climbed past 100 degrees. There was no cross ventilation, no electric fans, no relief. Servants worked 12-hour shifts in wool uniforms, then climbed 3 flights of stairs to sleep in rooms where the air felt thick enough to choke on. They opened the small dormer windows, but the breeze that reached them was faint, filtered through layers of heat absorbed by shingles and rafters. Some nights, they dragged their thin mattresses onto the roof itself just to breathe. Winter was equally harsh. The same attic rooms that trapped heat in summer bled it away through single-pane windows and uninsulated walls when snow fell. Central heating systems, fed by coal furnaces in the basement, were designed to warm the family floors first. By the time hot air reached the attic, it had dissipated. Servants slept under wool blankets in rooms where their breath condensed into fog. They woke to frost on the inside of the windows. On the coldest nights, water left in wash basins froze solid by morning. The Breakers offers the clearest case study. Designed by architect Richard Morris Hunt and completed in 1895, the mansion was a temple to Vanderbilt wealth. The Great Hall rose 2.5 stories, its walls clad in caen stone, its ceiling painted in imitation of an Italian palazzo. The music room featured platinum leaf on the walls and a carved marble fireplace imported from a French chateau. 33 indoor servants were required to maintain this grandeur. They lived on the 3rd floor. Their rooms measured 7 feet by 9 feet on average. 22 bedrooms shared 3 bathrooms. The hallways were 4 feet wide, barely enough for 2 people to pass without turning sideways. The windows were half the size of those on the family floors. There was no sitting room, no common space except the servants' dining hall in the basement. The message was clear. These were sleeping quarters, not living quarters. Servants were expected to work, not linger, but proximity was the deeper architecture at play. The servant floors sat directly above the family bedrooms. On quiet nights, footsteps echoed through plaster ceilings. The creak of floorboards, the scrape of furniture, the muffled sound of voices carried between floors. The families lived in close physical proximity to their staff, separated only by a layer of wood and plaster. Yet socially, the distance was absolute. Servants entered through separate doors, used separate staircases, ate separate meals at separate times in separate rooms. They shared the same roof, but inhabited entirely different worlds. The mansions of Fifth Avenue followed the same vertical logic. Cornelius Vanderbilt's chateau at Fifth Avenue and 57th Street housed 30 indoor servants on the 4th floor. Alva Vanderbilt's mansion at 52nd Street, later known as the Petit Chateau, employed a similar number in attic quarters tucked beneath the mansard roof. Allowed servants to move between floors without encountering family members or guests. Service corridors ran parallel to main hallways, hidden behind doors disguised as wall panels. The kitchens, sculleries, and laundries were located in the basement, as far as possible from the elegant rooms above, in ensuring that the smell of cooking and the sound of scrubbing never reached polite company. Every detail reinforced the hierarchy. The family entered through bronze doors. Servants entered through plain wood doors in the rear. The family climbed staircases with marble balustrades. Servants climbed narrow wooden stairs tucked into corners. The family slept in rooms with 12-foot ceilings. Servants slept in rooms where tall people could not stand upright without bending. The contrast was deliberate. The architecture itself was a machine designed to produce and maintain social distance. It stacked beauty downward and hardship upward. It placed comfort on display and suffering out of sight. And it worked. Guests toured the ballrooms and libraries, admired the tapestries and chandeliers, and never once thought to ask who polished them, who lit them, or where those people slept when the party ended. The illusion held because the architecture made it hold. Chapter 3. 33 Lives Under One Roof. At the Breakers alone, 33 indoor servants lived and worked behind a single family's fantasy. The day began before sunrise. Kitchen maids rose at 5 in the morning, climbed down 3 flights of narrow stairs in near darkness and lit the coal stoves that would heat water and cook breakfast. Housemaids followed at 5:30, carrying buckets and brushes to scrub floors before the family woke. Footmen polished silver in the pantry. Its laundresses began the first of several loads of washing in the basement. By 6 o'clock, the house was in motion, a carefully choreographed operation invisible to anyone still asleep on the second floor. Cornelius Vanderbilt II never saw this machinery. Neither did his wife Alice, nor their 7 children. The servants moved through the house like ghosts, arriving before the family stirred and disappearing before they were noticed. Breakfast appeared on the dining room sideboard at 8 sharp, prepared by a cook who had been working for 3 hours. Silver gleamed, crystals sparkled. The floors were spotless. Everything looked effortless. It was not. Behind the illusion stood a rigid structure of roles, rules, and relentless schedules. At the breakers, the 33 indoor servants were divided into strict hierarchies. At the top sat the butler, who managed the male staff and oversaw all service in the public rooms. Below him, the footmen, who served meals, answered doors, and carried messages. In the female hierarchy, the housekeeper managed the maids and maintained discipline. Below her, the lady's maid, who dressed Mrs. Vanderbilt and cared for her wardrobe. Then came the housemaids, who cleaned bedrooms and public spaces. The kitchen maid assisted the cook. The scullery maid washed dishes. The laundress handled linens. Each role had specific duties, specific hours, and specific uniforms. The uniforms themselves enforced the system. Maids wore black dresses with white aprons and caps in the morning. In the afternoon, if they served tea or answered the door, they changed into finer black dresses with lace aprons. The footmen wore livery, tailored coats, brass buttons, white gloves. The butler dressed in formal black. The uniforms announced rank at a glance. They also cost money. Servants were expected to provide their own, in often purchasing them from wages that rarely exceeded $20 a month. The wages reveal the economic engine beneath the architecture. A butler at the breakers earned roughly $60 per month. A footman earned $35. A housemaid earned $15 to $18. A scullery maid earned $10. Room and board were provided, but the hours were crushing. A typical housemaid worked from 5:30 in the morning until 9 at night, with 1 afternoon off per week. She scrubbed floors, made beds, emptied chamber pots, polished furniture, dusted shelves, and carried coal upstairs to light fireplaces in every bedroom before the family retired. She did this 6 days a week, 52 weeks a year, with perhaps 2 weeks of vacation if she was fortunate. The scale of labor required to maintain a mansion like the Breakers was staggering. 70 rooms demanded constant attention. Every bedroom fireplace needed fresh coal morning and night. That meant hauling hundreds of pounds of coal up 3 flights of stairs daily. Every oil lamp and gas lamp required trimming, cleaning, and refilling. Every piece of silver required polishing. Every window required washing. Every carpet required beating. The work never stopped because dirt never stopped. The ocean air brought salt. The coal furnaces brought soot. Guests brought mud on their shoes. The house itself generated dust simply by existing. At Cornelius Vanderbilt's Fifth Avenue Chateau, the numbers were similar. 30 indoor servants maintained 50 rooms. The mansion occupied an entire city block, fronting 130 feet on Fifth Avenue and 110 feet on 57th Street. The coal furnace consumed tons of anthracite each winter just to keep the public rooms at 68 degrees. The gas light system required a full-time engineer to maintain pressure and prevent leaks. The kitchen, and located in the basement, employed 4 people, a head cook, 2 assistant cooks, and a scullery maid. On nights when the Vanderbilts hosted dinner parties, additional staff were hired by the day. Dinner parties were the ultimate test of the system. A formal dinner for 20 guests required military precision. The cook prepared 14 courses over 8 hours. The footman set the table with 3 dozen pieces of silver per guest, multiple wine glasses, finger bowls, stand, place cards written in calligraphy. The butler coordinated service, ensuring that each course arrived simultaneously for all diners. The wine steward selected bottles from the cellar and decanted them at precise intervals. The housemaids ensured that every guest bedroom was immaculate in case anyone stayed overnight. From the guest's perspective, the evening flowed seamlessly. From the servant's perspective, it was organized chaos held together by training and fear of failure. The fear was real. Servants could be dismissed without notice for minor infractions: a chipped plate, a delayed meal, a wrinkled napkin. Mrs. Vanderbilt inspected the public rooms each morning with a white glove, checking for dust on mantels and picture frames. If she found any, the responsible maid was reprimanded. Repeat offenses led to dismissal. There were no appeals, no explanations. The system demanded perfection because the families demanded it. The houses were stages. The servants were stagehands, and any visible mistake shattered the performance. Yet the system also created a strange intimacy. Servants lived in the same house as their employers. They knew the family's schedules, their habits, their secrets. A lady's maid dressed Mrs. Vanderbilt every morning and undressed her every night. She knew every scar, every birthmark, every private vanity. The butler knew how much Mr. Vanderbilt drank after dinner. The housekeeper knew when arguments erupted behind closed doors. This proximity bred familiarity, but not equality. The servants were trusted with private knowledge precisely because they had no power to use it. The architecture ensured that. They slept in the attic. They ate in the basement. They traveled through hidden corridors. They were close enough to see everything and far enough away to matter. By the time the Gilded Age reached its peak in the late 1890s, this system had become the invisible foundation of American wealth. It was replicated in every mansion from Boston to San Francisco. The details varied, but the structure remained constant. A visible world of marble and silk sustained by an invisible world of coal and scrubbing and aching backs. The architecture of wealth was not just what you could see. It was what you were never meant to see. And it was about to crack. Chapter 4: The Attic Army. By dawn, before the first family member stirred, dozens of unseen workers were already in motion. 5:15 in the morning. The attic rooms at the breakers were still dark. A housemaid named Margaret, age 19, woke without an alarm clock. The body learned, 6 days a week for 11 months, the same hour. She dressed in the narrow space between her bed and the wall, pulled on the black wool dress and white apron, and tied her hair beneath a cotton cap. The room was cold. November in Newport meant frost on the inside of the dormer windows. She could see her breath. She was not alone. 8 other maids shared the attic hallway. They dressed in silence, conserving energy for the hours ahead. By 5:25, they were descending the back staircase, a steep wooden passage barely 3 feet wide that connected the servant floors to the basement. The stairs were unlit. They navigated by memory. In the basement kitchen, the coal stove was already burning. The kitchen maid, up since 5, had hauled 2 scuttles of anthracite from the coal cellar and stoked the fire. Water was heating in copper kettles. The cook arrived at 5:30, surveyed the kitchen, and began issuing orders. Breakfast for the family would be served at 8. That gave 2.5 hours to prepare eggs, toast, bacon, fresh rolls, fruit compote, and coffee. Simultaneously, servants' breakfast had to be ready by 6:30. 20 people to feed before the real work began. Margaret's job this morning: empty and clean all chamber pots on the second floor. Scrub the family bathrooms, dust the bedrooms, replace linens as needed. Light the bedroom fireplaces before 7:30 so the rooms would be warm when the family dressed. Chamber pots were the least dignified labor in the house. Every bedroom had one, porcelain vessels kept discreetly beneath the bed or behind a decorative screen. Indoor plumbing existed at the breakers, but the family used chamber pots during the night to avoid walking down cold hallways. Margaret collected them one by one, carried them down the back stairs to the scullery, emptied and rinsed them, scrubbed them with lye soap, dried them, and carried them back upstairs. 10 chamber pots per morning, 6 mornings per week. She had done this 2,800 times since she started working for the Vanderbilts 18 months ago. No one ever mentioned it. Not the family, and not the other servants. It was simply expected. By 7 o'clock, she was dusting the master bedroom. Mrs. Vanderbilt was still asleep. Margaret moved through the room like a shadow, careful not to make noise. Dust the mantel, dust the dresser, dust the picture frames, dust the window sills. Use a cloth dampened with vinegar to avoid raising particles into the air. The room was 20 feet by 25 feet, with a ceiling 14 feet high. It contained a 4-poster bed, 2 dressers, 3 wardrobes, a writing desk, 6 chairs, 2 side tables, and 17 decorative objects on various surfaces. Every single one required attention. Across the house, other servants were executing their own choreography. The footman polished the silver service in the butler's pantry, buffing each piece until it reflected light without streaks. The laundress was already halfway through her first load, scrubbing bedsheets by hand in a basement tub filled with hot water and lye. The butler checked the dining room table settings, adjusting the placement of each fork and knife to ensure perfect alignment. Outside, the gardeners raked gravel paths and trimmed hedges. In the stables, grooms fed horses and polished leather harnesses. The house was a machine. Every gear turned in synchronization. At 8 o'clock, breakfast was served. The footman carried silver trays from the kitchen, up the service stairs, through the service corridor, and into the dining room. They set the trays on the sideboard without a sound. Mrs. Vanderbilt appeared at 8:15. She ate toast and drank coffee. She did not speak to the servants. The butler stood by the door, silent and attentive, ready to respond to any request. None came. By 8:30, breakfast was over. The footman cleared the dishes and carried them back to the scullery, where the scullery maid scraped, washed, dried, and put them away. Margaret, meanwhile, was lighting fireplaces, and each fireplace required the same process. Remove yesterday's ashes, scrub the grate, lay fresh kindling, add coal, strike a match, wait for the fire to catch, adjust the flue. Repeat in the next room. The breakers had 13 fireplaces on the family floors alone. By 9 o'clock, her hands were black with soot. She washed them in cold water at the attic basin, then returned to dusting. The numbers tell the story of scale better than any description. At the breakers, the 33 indoor servants collectively worked approximately 720 hours per week. That is the equivalent of 18 full-time modern jobs compressed into a single household. They hauled an estimated 300 gallons of water up and down stairs daily, water used for washing, cooking, and filling decorative fountains. They polished 637 individual pieces of silver every week. They washed 174 windows 4 times per summer. They scrubbed 4,800 square feet of marble flooring on their knees with brushes and lye soap. They served an average of 900 meals per month during the summer season, counting both family and servant meals. The labor was quantifiable, repetitive, and invisible to anyone dining in the rooms above. Cornelius Vanderbilt's Fifth Avenue chateau demanded similar exertion. The mansion consumed 20 tons of coal each winter just for heating. That coal had to be hauled from the street delivery to the basement coal cellar, then scooped into scuttles and carried to the furnace every few hours. The gas light system used 60 burners, each requiring daily trimming and weekly cleaning. The kitchen prepared 3 meals per day for the family and staff, totaling nearly 1,100 meals per month. The laundry processed 300 pounds of linens weekly, all washed by hand. The tension in this system was not cruelty. It was invisibility. The labor was immense, but it was designed to leave no trace. Guests arrived at the Vanderbilt chateau and saw gleaming marble, polished silver, fresh flowers. They did not see Margaret emptying chamber pots at dawn, or the scullery maid scrubbing pots until her hands bled. They did not see the laundress standing over steaming tubs for 6 hours, or the footman polishing the same fork 3 times until it passed the butler's inspection. The architecture of the house ensured they would never see it. The back stairs, the service corridors, the attic bedrooms were all designed to keep the machinery out of view. But invisibility created a strange distortion. The servants were everywhere and nowhere. They moved through the house constantly, yet the family barely registered their presence. Mrs. Vanderbilt saw Margaret in her bedroom every morning, but she did not see Margaret. She saw a maid, a role, a function. The person inside the uniform was invisible. This distortion was not unique to the Vanderbilts. It was systemic, replicated in every great house of the era. Servants were essential but unacknowledged, trusted but not respected, close but distant. The architecture reinforced this paradox at every turn. The attic rooms placed servants physically above the family, yet socially beneath them. The back stairs allowed them to move through the house while remaining unseen. The uniforms marked them as different, even as they worked inches away from the people they served. And the servants understood this. They knew they were invisible. Some accepted it, others resented it. A few quietly resisted, moving slower than necessary, taking longer breaks, speaking just loud enough in the attic hallways to be heard through the ceiling below. But most simply endured. The wages were steady, the work was hard but predictable. And compared to factory labor or farm work, and in domestic service offered a kind of security until it did not. Chapter 5. rooms no guest ever saw. Guests toured libraries and galleries, yet few ever climbed the narrow back staircase to the top floor. The spatial logic of a Gilded Age mansion divided the world into two distinct realms. The front of the house, accessible through the main entrance, belonged to beauty and performance. The back of the house, accessed through service doors and narrow corridors of it. At the breakers, the separation was clear. The front realm was for guests. The back realm was for staff. The design made certain of it. At the breakers, the separation was architectural precision. The main staircase, a grand affair of carved oak and marble, rose from the great hall to the second-floor family bedrooms. It was wide enough for 3 people to walk abreast, its balustrade decorated with bronze details. By contrast, was an afterthought made functional, 3 feet wide. Undecorated wood, no windows. It connected the basement kitchens to the attic servant quarters, winding through 4 floors in a tight spiral. Servants climbed it dozens of times per day, hauling coal scuttles, laundry baskets, and trays of food. The stairs were steep and uneven, worn smooth by decades of footsteps. There was no railing on one side. You braced yourself against the wall. The same dual logic applied to hallways. The main corridors on the family floors were 8 feet wide, lit by chandeliers, decorated with oil paintings and oriental rugs. The service corridors ran parallel, hidden behind doors disguised as wall panels. These passages were 4 feet wide, painted white, lit by single electric bulbs. They allowed servants to move between the kitchen, the dining room, and the upstairs bedrooms without being seen. A footman could walk from the basement to the second floor and never cross paths with a family member or guest. The servant quarters themselves existed in a separate dimension entirely. At the breakers, the entire 3rd floor was devoted to staff housing. 22 bedrooms lined 2 hallways. Each room measured 7 feet by 9 feet. The ceilings were 7 feet high, just tall enough for most people to stand without stooping. The walls were plaster-painted white. The floors were bare wood. Each room contained an iron bedstead, a thin mattress, a single wooden chair, and a washstand with a ceramic basin and pitcher. There were no closets. Servants hung their uniforms on wall pegs. Personal belongings were stored in a trunk beneath the bed. Privacy was a luxury no one could afford. The bedroom doors had no locks. The housekeeper could enter at any time to inspect cleanliness. The walls were thin enough to hear conversations from adjacent rooms. At night, when all the servants retired after finishing their duties, the attic hallways filled with muffled voices, creaking bed springs, coughing, and the occasional sound of crying. 3 bathrooms served the 22 bedrooms. That meant roughly 7 people per bathroom. Each bathroom contained a toilet, a sink, and a single bathtub. Hot water was limited, and servants bathed once per week on their afternoon off, often sharing the same bathwater to conserve heat. The rest of the week, they washed at the small basins in their bedrooms, using cold water carried up from the basement in pitchers. The attic windows were small and positioned high on the walls. They provided light but limited ventilation. In summer, the rooms became unbearable, and temperatures under the slate roof exceeded 100 degrees during the day and barely dropped below 80 at night. Servants opened the windows, but the ocean breeze rarely reached the 3rd floor with enough force to make a difference. Some nights, the heat drove them to sleep on the roof itself, hauling their mattresses through dormer windows onto the flat sections between gables. Winter brought the opposite problem. The attic rooms bled heat through single-pane windows and uninsulated walls. The central heating system, fed by coal furnaces in the basement, was designed to warm the family floors first. By the time residual heat reached the attic, it was negligible. Servants slept under wool blankets in rooms where frost formed on the windows. They woke to frozen wash basins. Some mornings, the water in the pitcher had turned to ice overnight. Yet proximity remained the deepest paradox. The servant quarters at the breakers sat directly above the family bedrooms. The floor separating them was perhaps 12 inches of wood, plaster, and air. Sound traveled easily. A dropped shoe in the attic echoed in the bedroom below. Footsteps creaked through the ceiling. Late at night, when the house finally quieted, you could hear voices through the floorboards. The family and servants lived in parallel worlds, separated by inches, yet divided by unbridgeable social distance. Cornelius Vanderbilt's Fifth Avenue chateau replicated this pattern. The mansion's fourth floor housed servant quarters identical in spirit to those at the breakers. Narrow rooms, shared bathrooms, minimal furnishings. The contrast with the family floors below was stark. The second floor master bedroom was 400 square feet with a 16-foot ceiling. The fourth floor maid's room was 63 square feet with a 7-foot ceiling. The master bedroom had a marble fireplace, silk wallpaper, a private bathroom with hot running water, and a dressing room. The maid's room had a bed, a chair, and a washstand. The square footage alone quantified the disparity. The Vanderbilt chateau contained 50 rooms spanning approximately 22,000 square feet. The family occupied roughly 12,000 square feet across the first and second floors. The 30 servants shared approximately 3,000 square feet on the fourth floor. That meant each family member had access to roughly 3,000 square feet per person, while each servant had 100 square feet. But numbers only tell part of the story. The real separation was experiential. Family members moved through spaces designed to inspire awe. Guests entered the great hall and looked up at carved ceilings and imported tapestries. They walked on marble floors inlaid with bronze. They sat in rooms where every surface had been considered by architects and designers. The experience was immersive, intentional, beautiful. Servants moved through spaces designed for efficiency. The back stairs were narrow because narrow saved space. The attic rooms were small because small reduced heating costs. The service corridors were plain because decoration was unnecessary. No one cared what these spaces looked like because no one who mattered ever saw them. And yet, the servants spent more time in the mansion than anyone else. They woke in the attic, descended to the basement, moved through service corridors, climbed back stairs, worked in bedrooms and dining rooms, and returned to the attic to sleep. They inhabited every floor, every corner, every hidden passage. They knew the house more intimately than the family who owned it. They knew which floorboards creaked, which windows stuck, which doors did not latch properly. They knew where dust accumulated fastest, where gaslight fixtures leaked, where drafts whistled through cracks in winter. Yet none of this knowledge granted them ownership or belonging. They were inhabitants but not residents, workers but not members of the household in any meaningful sense. The architecture made this explicit. The servant quarters were part of the house, yet fundamentally separate from it. They were necessary but undesirable, essential but hidden. Guests who toured mansions like the Breakers or the Vanderbilt Chateau never asked about the attic. It did not occur to them. The architectural experience they were offered was carefully curated. They entered through the front door. They admired the Great Hall. They walked through drawing rooms, libraries, dining rooms. They marveled at the scale and beauty. And they left through the front door, never once wondering who cleaned the marble they walked on or where those people slept. For decades, the machinery ran smoothly. For decades, the machinery ran smoothly, hidden above the ceilings, behind the walls, beneath the notice of anyone dining on 14 courses in the rooms below. But machinery wears down, gears slip, and the first cracks were beginning to show. Chapter 6. When the illusion cracked. The illusion of effortless wealth depended on silence, but silence grows fragile under strain. In the summer of 1914, something changed in Newport. It was subtle at first. A butler resigned without warning. A cook left to work in a hotel. A housemaid failed to return after her day off. Individual departures were normal. Staff turned over. But that summer, the departures accelerated. By August, several of the great cottages were struggling to maintain full staffs. The breakers, which required 33 indoor servants, operated with 28. Rosecliff made do with a skeleton crew. Marble House advertised for housemaids and received 3 applications for 7 openings. The families blamed the servants. Young women no longer understood discipline, they said. The work ethic was eroding, but the real cause was structural, not moral. The economy was shifting. Alternatives to domestic service were emerging, and for the first time in decades, servants had leverage. The transformation began in the factories. Between 1900 and 1914, American manufacturing expanded dramatically. Steel mills, textile factories, and garment workshops opened in cities across the Northeast. They offered something domestic service could not: fixed hours. A factory worker clocked in at 7 in the morning and clocked out at 6 in the evening. The work was hard, sometimes dangerous, but when the shift ended, your time was your own. You did not sleep in an attic above your employer. You were not on call at midnight if a guest needed fresh towels. You had nights. You had Sundays. You had boundaries. The wages were comparable. A housemaid at the breakers earned $18 per month with room and board. A textile worker in a Providence factory earned $22 per month without room and board. When you calculated the value of free housing and meals, domestic service paid slightly more, but the factory worker controlled her own life. That was worth the difference. Then came the war. When Europe descended into conflict in August 1914, American factories began producing for Allied governments. The demand for labor surged. Factory wages rose. By 1916, a textile worker could earn $28 per month. By 1917, $35. The gap widened, and servants began to leave. The war also disrupted immigration. Before 1914, the mansions of Fifth Avenue and Newport relied heavily on Irish, German, and Swedish immigrants as a steady supply of domestic labor. These women arrived in New York with few skills and limited English. Domestic service was often their only option. They accepted low wages and strict conditions because the alternative was poverty. But immigration from Europe slowed to a trickle during the war. The steady supply of new servants dried up. Families could no longer replace departing staff as easily as before. The servant shortage created tension. Families accustomed to 30 servants now managed with 20, then 15. Some rooms were closed off, dust covers thrown over furniture. Meals became simpler because the kitchen was understaffed. Standards slipped. At the Vanderbilt Chateau on Fifth Avenue, the housekeeper complained that she could not maintain cleanliness with only 8 maids. 8. A number that would have seemed absurd to a middle-class family seemed impossibly small to a household managing 50 rooms. The families tried to adapt. They raised wages. They offered better food in the servants' dining hall. They allowed an extra half-day off per week. But the structural problem remained. Domestic service was live in labor with no fixed hours, no privacy, and no autonomy. Factory work offered independence. The choice became obvious. Some families turned to agencies that specialized in placing servants. These agencies charged fees and made promises, but the quality of staff declined. The experienced butler who had managed the household for 20 years was replaced by a younger man with minimal training. The cook, who knew every family preference, left for a hotel kitchen, replaced by someone competent but uninspired. The housemaids were newer, less experienced, and less willing to tolerate the strict hierarchies that once governed the attic floors. Labor organizing emerged as another pressure point. In 1917, a small group of domestic workers in New York attempted to form a union. The effort failed, but the idea circulated. Servants began talking among themselves about wages, hours, conditions. They compared notes. They realized they were not alone in their frustrations. The attic rooms, once silent, filled with quiet rebellion. At the breakers, a housemaid named Catherine was dismissed for demanding 1 full day off per week instead of 1 afternoon. She was 24 years old and had worked for the Vanderbilts for 3 years. She found a job in a Providence department store within a week, earning more money with better hours. She never looked back. Her departure sent a message to the remaining staff. There were options. The families did not see themselves as exploitative. They provided employment, housing, and meals. They paid wages. They followed the customs of their class. But the customs were fracturing. The world beyond the attic windows was changing faster than the families could accept. The war accelerated everything. Women took factory jobs, drove ambulances, worked in hospitals. The old hierarchies felt increasingly hollow. The point of no return came in 1918. The influenza pandemic swept through the United States, killing 675,000 people. The disease spread easily in crowded conditions. Attic rooms, where servants slept in close quarters and shared bathrooms, were particularly vulnerable. At several Newport cottages, entire staffs fell ill simultaneously. Some servants died. Others recovered but left domestic service entirely, unwilling to risk their health for $18 per month. The pandemic revealed the fragility of the system. The mansions required constant labor to function. When labor disappeared, the houses began to fail. Coal furnaces went unlit, dust accumulated, meals were delayed or skipped, linens went unwashed. The beautiful rooms, designed to inspire awe, became uncomfortable and cold. The architecture had not changed, but the human machinery that animated it was breaking down. Families began to reconsider. Was it worth maintaining a 50-room mansion if you could only staff it with 10 servants? Could you host dinner parties without a full complement of footmen and kitchen staff? Could you live in a palace designed for 30 invisible workers if you could only find 15? Some families sold. Others closed up floors, living in a fraction of the space. A few tried to modernize, installing electric heating, and reducing the need for coal hauling. But the fundamental problem remained. The architecture was designed for an economic and social system that no longer existed. The attic rooms, once filled with 24 sleeping servants, began to empty. The narrow back staircases, once crowded with workers hauling water and coal, grew quiet. The system that had sustained Gilded Age grandeur for 60 years was collapsing under its own weight. The illusion of effortless wealth had always been fragile. It depended on an invisible army willing to endure hardship for modest wages. When that army found better options, the illusion shattered. The attic floors, for so long hidden above the silk and marble, were finally exposed for what they were: a vast infrastructure of human labor that could not be sustained indefinitely. The grandeur remained, but the machinery was failing. And the families who built these houses were about to learn a hard truth. Beauty built on silence cannot survive when silence ends. Chapter 7: The Servant Shortage. By the 1920s, some mansions stood half-staffed, their attics echoing with absence. The war ended in November 1918, but the servant shortage did not. If anything, it worsened. The soldiers came home. Factories that produced for the war effort retooled for consumer goods. The economy boomed. Wages rose across every sector except one: domestic service. Families tried to hold wages steady, arguing that room and board compensated for lower pay. But the math no longer worked. A housemaid earning $20 per month in 1925 could earn $40 per month working in a department store, a telephone exchange, or a clerical office. She would have her evenings. She would have her Sundays. She would not sleep in an attic. The exodus accelerated. By 1925, domestic service had declined from the single largest employer of women in 1900 to a shrinking profession concentrated among older workers and recent immigrants. But young women rejected it outright. In cities across America, want ads appeared in newspapers. Reliable housemaid needed, good wages, references required. The ads ran for weeks without response. Newport felt the shortage acutely. The summer colony had always depended on a large transient population of servants who arrived in May and departed in October. Local families could not supply enough workers, so agencies recruited from Boston, New York, and Providence. But by the mid-1920s, a recruitment was failing. The great cottages that once employed 30 or 40 servants operated with 15 or 20. Some closed entirely, their owners citing the impossibility of maintaining them without adequate staff. The breakers struggled. Cornelius Vanderbilt II had died in 1899. His widow Alice continued summering at the mansion until her death in 1934. But the household she maintained bore little resemblance to the one her husband built. In 1928, the breakers employed 18 indoor servants, half the original number. Entire sections of the house were closed off. Guest bedrooms on the second floor gathered dust. The attic rooms, once crowded with maids and footmen, housed fewer than a dozen people. On quiet nights, you could hear your footsteps echo through the empty hallways. The demographic shift was measurable. In 1895, Newport's population included 2,287 domestic servants out of 19,384 residents. By 1930, the census recorded only 963 domestic servants out of a population that had grown to 27,149. The ratio had collapsed from nearly 12% to less than 4%. The physical infrastructure remained, the attic bedrooms and back staircases and service corridors, but the people who once filled them were gone. Immigration restrictions compounded the problem. The Immigration Act of 1924 imposed strict quotas limiting arrivals from Southern and Eastern Europe. Irish and Italian immigration, which had supplied much of the domestic labor force, slowed dramatically. The steady stream of young women arriving at Ellis Island and taking jobs as housemaids dried up. Families could no longer count on a continuous supply of workers willing to accept low wages and harsh conditions. The economic context had shifted fundamentally. The 1920s brought new opportunities for women. Clerical work expanded as businesses grew. Retail jobs multiplied as consumer culture boomed. Telephone operators were in high demand. Nursing offered professional status. Teaching remained a respectable career. Every one of these occupations offered something domestic service did not: social legitimacy. A woman could tell her family she worked in an office or a store. Working as a maid carried stigma, a sense of subservience that young women increasingly rejected. The mansions of Fifth Avenue faced identical pressures. Cornelius Vanderbilt II's chateau, once staffed by 30 indoor servants, operated with 12 by 1928. The coal furnaces still required tending, but now a single janitor did the work once divided among 3 men. The kitchen that once employed a head cook and 3 assistants now had a cook and 1 helper. Meals became simpler. The gaslight system, installed in 1883, was replaced by electric lighting, reducing the need for daily maintenance. Central heating improved, reducing the coal hauling. Technology substituted for some labor, but not all. The cleaning remained relentless. 50 rooms did not generate less dust simply because fewer people lived in them. The marble floors still required scrubbing. The windows still required washing. The silver still required polishing. But with 12 servants instead of 30, the work became impossible to complete properly. Standards declined. The butler who once inspected every fork for streaks now accepted good enough. The housekeeper who once insisted on daily dusting settled for twice per week. The house was maintained, but not to the old standard. The attic rooms told the story most clearly. At the Vanderbilt Chateau, the 4th floor servant quarters had been designed for 30 people. Each small bedroom, each shared bathroom, each narrow hallway was calculated for maximum occupancy. But by 1930, fewer than 10 servants lived there. The empty bedrooms became storage spaces, filled with old furniture and trunks. The hallways felt cavernous. At night, the few remaining servants could hear the house settling around them, the creaks and groans of a structure built for crowds, but now inhabited by a handful. Some families abandoned the live in model entirely. They hired day workers who arrived in the morning and departed in the evening. The cook came at 7 and left at 4. The housemaids worked 8-hour shifts. The butler managed on a salary without room and board. This approach reduced costs and eliminated the need to maintain servant quarters, but it also eliminated the availability that had defined Gilded Age service. If the family wanted dinner at 9, someone had to be present to prepare it. If a guest arrived unexpectedly, someone had to be available to open the door. The flexibility that came from having servants always present, always on call, disappeared when staff went home at the end of a shift. The architecture itself became a burden. The great mansions were designed for an economic model that no longer existed. The service corridors, back stairs, and attic rooms represented wasted space. The kitchens, located in basements far from dining rooms, required staff to carry food up multiple flights. The coal furnaces demanded constant attention. Every design choice that once made sense in a world of abundant, cheap labor became a liability when labor grew scarce and expensive. By the late 1920s, the families who built them had imagined a world where they could live in a mansion and not have to worry about the upkeep. They had imagined a world where they could live in a mansion and not have to worry about the upkeep. The families who built them had imagined permanence. They had erected palaces meant to last centuries, monuments to wealth and power. But the human infrastructure that made those palaces livable was evaporating. The attic floors stood as the most visible symbol of the system's collapse. The narrow rooms designed to house 24 servants now held 5 or 6. The shared bathrooms, once crowded, sat empty most of the day. The back staircases, once trafficked constantly, grew dusty. The servant quarters had been invisible by design. Now they were invisible by abandonment. And the families, looking up from their marble floors and silk wallpaper, were beginning to ask a question that would have seemed absurd 30 years earlier. Could they survive without the attic army? The answer, it turned out, was no. Not comfortably, not in the style they had built these houses to sustain. The grandeur was intact, but the machinery had stopped. And without the machinery, grandeur was just empty rooms and expensive stone. Chapter 8. Grandeur without the army. Marble and mahogany remained, but the human engine that powered them was faltering. The families adapted because they had no choice. The question was not whether to change, but how much change they could tolerate before the houses themselves became unlivable. Some embraced technology, others reduced their expectations. A few attempted to recreate the old system through sheer financial force. All of them, in different ways, confronted the same truth. The architecture no longer matched the available labor. Electric lighting was the first substitute. Gas lights had required daily maintenance. Wicks needed trimming. Mantles needed replacing. And gas pressure had to be monitored. A single footman could spend 3 hours per day maintaining 60 fixtures. Electric lights, by contrast, required almost no attention. You flipped a switch. The light worked. When a bulb burned out, you replaced it. By 1925, most Fifth Avenue mansions had converted fully to electricity. The change eliminated one job entirely and freed other servants for different tasks. Central heating followed a similar logic. Coal furnaces were labor-intensive. They required constant stoking, ash removal, and monitoring to maintain even temperatures. A mansion the size of the Vanderbilt chateau consumed 20 tons of coal each winter, all of it hauled by hand from the coal cellar to the furnace. Oil-fired boilers, introduced in the 1920s, reduced that labor significantly. A single worker could manage a system that once required 3. The technology was expensive to install, but it paid for itself in reduced wages within a few years. Vacuum cleaners replaced some manual sweeping. Electric washing machines appeared in basement laundries, reducing the hours spent scrubbing linens by hand. Refrigeration units allowed food storage without daily ice deliveries. Each innovation chipped away at the need for human labor. But each innovation also cost money, and some families were reluctant to invest. The old ways had worked for decades. Why change? The answer was simple: because you could not find enough servants to maintain the old ways. Even families resistant to change eventually installed electric lighting and central heating. The alternative was living in darkness and cold, tended by a skeleton staff that could not keep up with the demands of a 50-room mansion. But technology could not replace every task. Someone still had to cook. Someone still had to clean. Someone still had to answer the door, serve meals, wash dishes, and make beds. The core labor remained stubbornly human, and as the staff numbers dwindled, that labor became more visible. Mrs. Vanderbilt, living at the Breakers with 18 servants instead of 33, noticed. The drawing room was dusted less frequently. Meals appeared later. The butler, once omnipresent and invisible, now seemed rushed, distracted. The illusion of effortless grandeur cracked when effort became visible. And it was becoming visible everywhere. Some families responded by lowering standards. Rooms that once gleamed were allowed to gather dust. Dinner parties, once elaborate 14-course affairs, were reduced to simpler menus. Guest bedrooms were closed off, their furniture covered with sheets. The house remained grand, but it felt dormant, like a theater between performances. Others reduced their time in the mansions. Families who once spent 6 months at their Newport cottage now stayed 6 weeks. The rest of the year, the house stood empty, maintained by a caretaker and perhaps 2 or 3 staff. This approach reduced costs, but defeated the purpose of building the house in the first place. A mansion designed to showcase wealth loses its function when no one sees it. A few families tried to maintain the old standards through higher wages. They doubled salaries, offered bonuses, provided better accommodations. These efforts sometimes worked in the short term. A talented cook could be lured away from a hotel with the right offer. But the broader trend was irreversible. Domestic service was declining, not because wages were too low, but because the work itself was undesirable. No amount of money could fully compensate for living in an attic and being on call 24 hours a day when alternatives offered freedom. The mismatch between architecture and workforce became acute. Consider the formal dining room at the Vanderbilt Chateau. The room seated 30 guests comfortably. It featured a table 16 feet long, carved from a single piece of mahogany. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling painted to resemble a European palace. The walls were covered in silk damask. Serving a dinner in this room required military coordination, footmen to carry dishes, a butler to oversee service, kitchen staff to prepare food, scullery maids to wash up afterward. With 30 servants, the system worked flawlessly. With 12 servants, it became a scramble. The room was designed for a machine that no longer existed. The same problem repeated throughout these houses. The conservatory required a gardener to tend plants. The library required a maid to dust thousands of books. The ballroom required a team to maintain the polished floor. Each space assumed abundant labor. When labor disappeared, the spaces became burdens. Some families sold. Between 1920 and 1930, the several Fifth Avenue mansions changed hands or were demolished. The land was worth more than the buildings. Real estate developers recognized that office towers and apartment buildings generated better returns than aging single-family homes, however grand. The Vanderbilt Chateau on Fifth Avenue and 57th Street survived, but others did not. A T. Stewart's mansion, once the largest private residence in New York, was demolished in 1929. The William Kissam Vanderbilt Mansion at 5th Avenue and 52nd Street fell in 1926. The demolitions shocked the families who remained. These were supposed to be permanent structures, monuments meant to outlast their builders. Instead, they were being erased within a generation. In Newport, the cottages fared slightly better, protected by geography and nostalgia. But even there, the writing was visible. Families who once competed to build the largest, at most ornate mansion now competed to minimize costs. Some converted their houses to seasonal use only, closing them from October to May. Others donated them to institutions, taking tax deductions and eliminating maintenance costs. A few simply locked the doors and walked away, leaving caretakers to prevent vandalism, but making no effort to preserve the interiors. The attic room stood as the clearest evidence of failure. At the breakers, the third-floor servant quarters housed fewer than 10 people by 1930. The empty bedrooms echoed. The hallways felt enormous. The architecture, designed to pack dozens of workers into minimal space, felt absurd when nearly empty. The narrow windows, the low ceilings, the shared bathrooms, all the features that made sense when maximizing density, became oppressive when inhabited by a handful of people rattling around in spaces meant for crowds. The back staircases, once constantly trafficked, grew dusty. Servants used them still, but sporadically. A maid might climb them twice per day instead of 20 times. The wood, polished smooth by decades of footsteps, began to dull. The structural elements of the servant infrastructure, the stairs and corridors and attic rooms, were becoming relics. They were still physically present, still part of the architecture, but their function had ended, and the families were left with a question. What do you do with a palace built for 30 servants when you can only afford 10? The answer, increasingly, was that you could not do anything. The houses were fundamentally mismatched to the economic reality of the 1920s and 30s. They were monuments to a system that no longer existed, and monuments without the machinery to sustain them become tombs. The grandeur remained intact. The marble floors, the carved ceilings, the imported tapestries, all the visible markers of wealth persisted. But the invisible infrastructure, the attic rooms and back stairs and service corridors, sat empty. Beauty without labor is just architecture, and architecture alone cannot make a house feel alive. Chapter 9. The End of the Attic Era. After 60 years, the attic floors that once held dozens of lives began to fall silent. The Great Depression arrived in October 1929 and changed everything. So the stock market crash wiped out fortunes overnight. Families who considered themselves secure discovered they were not. Investments vanished. Income streams dried up. Suddenly, maintaining a 50-room mansion with even a reduced staff seemed impossible. The economic logic that had sustained these houses collapsed. The first response was retrenchment. Families cut staff immediately. The butler was let go. The footmen were dismissed. The housemaids, already reduced in number, were cut further. Then households that operated with 15 servants in 1929 were down to 5 by 1931. The attic rooms emptied rapidly. At the breakers, which had employed 18 servants in 1928, the number dropped to 7 by 1932. 7 people to maintain 70 rooms. It was impossible, and families knew it. The houses, already difficult to manage in the 1920s, became actively unlivable in the 1930s. The rooms were closed off entirely. Dust covers went over furniture. Shutters were closed to protect interiors from sunlight. The grand public spaces, the drawing rooms and ballrooms and libraries, sat unused. What was the point of hosting a dinner party when you could barely afford to heat the dining room? Mrs. Alice Vanderbilt, living at the Breakers, watched her world contract. She had married into the family at the height of Gilded Age excess, when 33 servants seemed normal, and Newport summers revolved around lavish parties. Now, in her 70s, she lived in a handful of rooms while the rest of the house decayed around her. She died in 1934. The house passed to her daughter Gladys, Countess Swelteringly, who faced an immediate decision: keep it or sell it. Selling was not simple. Who would buy a 70-room mansion during the Depression? The market for such houses had evaporated. The costs of maintenance were staggering, even when staffing was minimal. Property taxes alone ran thousands of dollars per year. Heating, insurance, repairs, all of it added up to expenses that required serious wealth to sustain. And serious wealth was suddenly scarce. Some families donated their mansions to institutions. Schools, museums, and charitable organizations accepted the houses, though often reluctantly. The buildings were impressive, but impractical. A museum could use the public rooms for exhibitions, but what do you do with 20 attic bedrooms and a basement coal furnace? The servant quarters, designed for function rather than beauty, had no value to institutions focused on displaying art and architecture. They were closed off, locked, forgotten. The attic floors became ghost spaces. At mansions across Fifth Avenue and Newport, the narrow bedrooms sat empty. The iron bedsteads remained, along with washstands and chairs. But the people were gone. No one woke at 5 in the morning to light coal stoves. No one climbed the back staircases hauling buckets of water. No one scrubbed floors or polished silver or emptied chamber pots. The labor that had defined these spaces for 60 years simply ended. The climax came in waves, not a single dramatic moment. Individual houses were sold or demolished or donated across the 1930s. Cornelius Vanderbilt, II's chateau on Fifth Avenue, was sold to real estate developers in 1926, before the Depression even began. The building was demolished in 1927 to make way for the Bergdorf Goodman department store. The attic rooms where 30 servants once slept were erased entirely, replaced by retail space selling luxury goods. And the irony was sharp. A house built to display wealth through human labor was replaced by a store selling wealth through consumer goods. Other mansions followed. The William Henry Vanderbilt mansion at Fifth Avenue and 51st Street was demolished in 1947. The A.T. Stewart mansion came down in 1929. The Cornelius Vanderbilt III mansion at Fifth Avenue and 58th Street fell in 1945. Each demolition erased not just architecture, but the hidden infrastructure of servant quarters, back stairs, and service corridors. The attic rooms, which had housed thousands of servants over decades, were reduced to rubble and hauled away in trucks. In Newport, demolition was rarer, but abandonment was common. Several cottages stood empty through the Depression, their owners unable to afford maintenance but unwilling to sell. The houses decayed, roofs leaked, windows broke, vandalism occurred. The wooden bedrooms, the thin plaster walls, the shared bathrooms, all of it fell apart without care. The breakers survived because the Preservation Society of Newport County stepped in. In 1948, the society leased the property from the Swelteringly family and opened it to the public as a museum, and visitors could tour the Great Hall, the drawing rooms, the dining room. They could admire the marble and gilt and imported stone. But the third floor remained closed. The servant quarters were not part of the tour. They were not considered historically significant. They were just old bedrooms, cramped and plain, with nothing to offer tourists seeking beauty and grandeur. It would be decades before anyone thought to ask, where did the servants live? What were their lives like? The attic rooms, invisible by design for 60 years, remained invisible for decades more. They were cleaned occasionally to prevent decay, but they were not restored, not interpreted, not acknowledged. The history of the breakers, as told to visitors, centered on the Vanderbilt family and their wealth. The servants were footnotes, if mentioned at all. The system that sustained Gilded Age grandeur had ended. The economic model of abundant cheap labor, the immigration streams that supplied workers, the social expectations that made domestic service acceptable, all of it had collapsed. The attic floors, once crowded with sleeping servants, stood empty. The back staircases, once trafficked constantly, gathered dust. The service corridors, once essential pathways through the house, were locked and forgotten. The houses remained, but the human machinery that made them function was gone. And without that machinery, the houses were just shells. Beautiful shells, certainly. The attic army had served for 60 years, but shells nonetheless, hollow monuments to a way of life that could not survive the economic and social changes of the 20th century. The attic army had served for 60 years. It had hauled coal, scrubbed floors, polished silver, and made beauty possible. It had lived in narrow rooms, endured heat in summer and cold in winter, worked 16-hour days, and remained invisible to the guests admiring the marble and silk below. And then, across a single decade, it vanished. The Depression finished what the labor shortage of the 1920s had begun. The attic floors fell silent. The servant era ended. What remained were empty rooms and unanswered questions. The rooms could be measured, photographed, preserved. The questions were harder. What did it feel like to sleep in those rooms? What dreams were dreamed there? What conversations happened in those narrow hallways late at night when the work was finally done? The architecture survived, but the lived experience did not. And the silence that followed the end of the attic era was deeper than any that came before. Chapter 10: Ghost Floors of Fifth Avenue. Today, visitors admire restored parlors, rarely asking who once slept above them. The Breakers receives more than 400,000 visitors per year. They arrive by car and bus, walking through the wrought iron gates and approaching the limestone facade. So tour guides lead them through the Great Hall, explaining the Caen stone columns, the carved oak panels, the allegorical ceiling paintings. The groups move through the music room, the ballroom, the dining room. They pause to admire the 16-foot mahogany table, the crystal chandeliers, the imported silk wallpaper. Cameras click. Children press their faces to velvet ropes. The guides recite facts about construction costs, architectural styles, and Vanderbilt family history. The tour never goes to the third floor. The attic rooms remain, physically intact, but inaccessible to the public. The narrow bedrooms, the shared bathrooms, the steep back staircases, all of it exists exactly as it did in 1895. But visitors do not see it. The Preservation Society of Newport County made a decision decades ago. The servant quarters were not part of the narrative. Tourists came to see beauty and excess, not cramped bedrooms and evidence of labor. The attic was closed off, its doors locked, its existence barely mentioned. This is not unique to the breakers. At mansion museums across the country, servant spaces are hidden or omitted entirely. The emphasis is on public rooms, family bedrooms, and architectural grandeur. The infrastructure that made those spaces function, the kitchens and laundries and servant quarters, are treated as secondary, if acknowledged at all. The result is a distorted history. Visitors leave believing these houses operated through some mysterious, effortless magic, never confronting the reality that beauty required labor, and labor required people living in conditions no modern worker would tolerate. In recent years, some museums have begun to change this approach. At a handful of sites, including the breakers, limited tours now include the servant quarters. Small groups climb the back stairs, duck through low doorways, and enter the narrow bedrooms. The contrast is immediate. The ceilings drop from 14 feet to 7. The windows shrink. The floors change from polished marble to bare wood. The shift is visceral, a physical reminder of the hierarchies embedded in the architecture. Guides explain the daily routines. They describe the 5 o'clock wake-up calls, the chamber pots, the coal hauling, the 16-hour workdays. They point out the washstands, the shared bathrooms, the hooks on the wall where servants hung their uniforms. Some visitors are shocked. They had not imagined such conditions existing directly above the silk and marble below. Others are skeptical. Was it really that bad? Did people truly live this way? The evidence is in the rooms themselves. Measure the space, 7 feet by 9 feet per person. Calculate the summer heat under a slate roof with minimal ventilation. Consider the winter cold with single-pane windows and no insulation. Examine the shared bathroom serving 7 people. The architecture speaks clearly. These were not comfortable spaces. They were efficient spaces, designed to house workers cheaply and maintain the separation between labor and luxury. But the museums struggle with interpretation. How do you tell the story of servants without descending into voyeurism or judgment? The families who built these houses were not monsters. They were products of their time, operating within a widely accepted system. The servants themselves made choices, however limited. Domestic service offered steady wages and housing at a time when alternatives were scarce. The narrative is complex, neither purely exploitative nor purely benign. Some museums have begun using paranormal stories as entry points. The attic rooms, long closed and atmospheric, have generated ghost tales. Visitors report hearing footsteps on the 3rd floor when the house is empty. Doors that were locked are found open. Cold spots appear in certain bedrooms. Shadows move in peripheral vision. The stories spread online, attracting ghost hunters and paranormal enthusiasts. The museums neither confirm nor dismiss these accounts. The footsteps could be settling wood in an old house. The doors could have faulty latches. The cold spots could be drafts from poorly insulated windows. But they could also be something else. The ambiguity is useful. It draws attention to spaces that were invisible for too long. People who would never attend a lecture on domestic labor will take a ghost tour. And once they are in the attic, standing in those narrow rooms, the history becomes impossible to ignore. The best paranormal interpretation acknowledges both perspectives. Yes, footsteps echo in the attic. Old houses make noise. Wood expands and contracts. Floors creak under temperature changes. But also, yes, 24 people lived here. They moved through these hallways every day for decades. Their presence was real, their labor was constant, and their lives were largely unrecorded. If you hear footsteps, it might be memory as much as sound. The house remembers what we have forgotten. This approach leaves the verdict open. It respects both the skeptics and the believers. It uses mystery as a gateway to history. And it works. Visitor interest in the servant quarters has increased significantly wherever tours are offered. People want to understand the hidden infrastructure. They want to see the attic rooms, climb the back stairs, and confront the discomfort of realizing that beauty had a cost. On Fifth Avenue, the physical evidence is mostly gone. The mansions were demolished. The attic rooms were erased, but a few fragments remain. The building that replaced the Cornelius Vanderbilt II chateau, now occupied by Bergdorf Goodman, still has a few original architectural elements embedded in its structure. Sections of the foundation, some interior walls, which traces of the old house persist beneath the retail space, invisible to shoppers browsing luxury goods. Other mansions survive in altered form. The Henry Clay Frick Mansion at 5th Avenue and 70th Street is now the Frick Collection Museum. The house has been modified extensively, but the original servant quarters remain in the basement and attic. They are not open to the public, used instead for storage and administrative offices. But they exist. The narrow staircases, the small rooms, the low ceilings, all of it is still there, hidden behind closed doors, while tourists admire Rembrandt paintings in the galleries below. The question museums face is whether to make these spaces visible. There is practical resistance. Attic rooms are not climate controlled. They do not meet modern accessibility standards. They require maintenance and staffing to open safely, and they complicate the narrative. It is easier to tell a story of wealth and art than a story of wealth built on hidden labor. But the easier story is incomplete. The ghost floors persist. Some are locked and forgotten. Others are slowly being rediscovered and interpreted. The process is uneven, dependent on funding and institutional priorities. But the trend is clear. The attic rooms, invisible by design for 60 years and ignored for decades more, are finally being acknowledged. The servants who lived there, by absence, and visitors standing in by absence. And visitors standing in those narrow rooms are beginning to ask the questions that should have been asked a century ago. Who were these people? What were their lives like? And what does it mean that we built our most beautiful houses on top of their suffering? Chapter 11. The cost written in brick. Every ornate facade concealed a ledger of wages, hours, and human endurance. The economics of Gilded Age grandeur were precise. The houses themselves cost fortunes to build. The breakers required $7 million to construct in 1895, equivalent to roughly $200 million today. Cornelius Vanderbilt II's Fifth Avenue Chateau cost $3 million in 1883, approximately $85 million in modern terms. But construction was only the beginning. Operating these houses required continuous expenditure, and the largest line item was always labor. At the breakers, 33 indoor servants earned a combined payroll of approximately $9,600 per year in 1895. That included the butler at $60 per month, the housekeeper at $50, the cook at $45, the lady's maid at $35, and descending ranks of footmen, housemaids, and kitchen staff earning between $10 and $30 per month. Add outdoor staff, stable workers, and groundskeepers, and the total annual labor cost approached $15,000. That was just wages. Factor in room and board, uniforms, and incidental expenses, and the true cost reached $20,000 annually. $20,000 does not sound crushing today. But consider the context. They spent more on their staff than 40 average families earned combined. And this was for a single season in a single house. The family maintained multiple residences. The Fifth Avenue Chateau had its own staff. The total payroll across all properties reached $50,000 per year, the equivalent of more than 100 median household incomes. The numbers quantify the system's scale. Newport in 1895 housed 2,287 domestic servants working for approximately 450 families. That meant each family employed an average of 5 servants. But the distribution was not even. Working-class families employed none. Middle-class families might hire 1 maid. The wealthiest families employed 30 or more. The top 50 families in Newport, less than 12% of the summer colony, employed more than half the total servant population. The wages themselves reveal the hierarchy. A butler earning $60 per month was at the top of the servant class. He managed other staff, controlled access to the family, and wielded significant power within the household. But $60 per month was still only $720 per year, less than twice the median household income. The housekeeper, earning $50 per month, made $600 annually. The cook, at $45 per month, earned $540. These were the elite servants, skilled and experienced. Below them, the wages dropped sharply. A housemaid earning $18 per month made $216 per year, less than half the median household income. A scullery maid at $10 per month earned $120, barely a quarter of what an average family made. These workers lived better than they would have in tenements, but not by much. Room and board had value, but the work was relentless. The hours were endless, and the wages left little for savings or family support. The families viewed these expenditures as necessary. A mansion without staff was uninhabitable. The architecture itself demanded labor. Consider the coal furnace at the breakers. It consumed approximately 400 tons of anthracite per year to heat the house during the Newport season. That coal cost $8 per ton, totaling $3,200 annually. But the real cost was labor. The coal had to be delivered, hauled to the basement, shoveled into the furnace, and constantly monitored. Ashes had to be removed. Dampers had to be adjusted. A single worker, employed full-time, managed this system. His wages added another $360 per year. The total cost of heating. The breakers, combining fuel and labor, approached $4,000 annually. Food represented another major expense. The kitchen at the breakers prepared 3 meals per day for the family and staff, totaling more than 1,000 meals per week during the summer season. Grocery costs ran approximately $300 per month, or $3,600 per year. The cook and kitchen staff added another $900 in wages. The total cost of feeding everyone under the roof reached $4,500 annually. The scale grows clearer when you aggregate. At the breakers, annual operating costs in 1895 broke down roughly as follows. Staff wages $9,600, staff room and board $4,000, heating $4,000, food $4,500, maintenance and repairs $2,000, property taxes $1,500. The total approached $25,500 per year. That was the cost of maintaining Grandeur for a single summer season. Multiply that by 60 years, the lifespan of the attic era from 1880 to 1940. The breakers alone consumed approximately $1,530,000 in operating costs over 6 decades, equivalent to roughly $40 million today. And the breakers was one house among dozens in Newport, one among hundreds of Gilded Age mansions across the country. The human cost is harder to quantify, but no less real. A housemaid working at the breakers from age 18 to age 30, a typical career span, spent 12 years waking at 5 in the morning, working 16-hour days, and sleeping in a 7-by-9-foot attic room. She earned approximately $216 per year, totaling $2,592 over 12 years. That was the price of her youth, her health, and a significant portion of her life. So the families did not see themselves as exploitative. They paid market wages. They provided housing and food. They followed the customs of their class. But the system itself was exploitative, built on an imbalance of power and opportunity. The servants had few alternatives. The families had every advantage. The architecture, the wages, the hierarchies, all of it reinforced this imbalance. The attic floors were the physical manifestation of the economic logic. Build small rooms to minimize costs, stack them high to maximize density, provide minimal amenities to reduce expenses. The goal was efficiency, not comfort. The rooms were cheaper per square foot than any other part of the house because they generated no social or aesthetic value. They were invisible, utilitarian, designed to house workers as cheaply as possible while keeping them close enough to be useful. The contrast with the family floors was financial as well as spatial. The second floor master bedroom at the breakers cost approximately $10,000 to furnish and decorate. The third floor servant bedrooms cost $50 each. The ratio was 200 to 1. This disparity was intentional. The families invested in spaces that displayed wealth. They minimized investment in spaces that did not, but the entire system depended on those minimized spaces. Without the attic rooms, there would be no servants. Without servants, there would be no way to maintain the marble and silk below. The attic was the foundation, hidden and devalued, but essential. The architecture of wealth was a pyramid, and the attic was the base. When the system collapsed in the 1920s and 30s, the economic logic collapsed with it. The families could no longer afford or attract the staff needed to maintain these houses. The attic rooms emptied. The operating costs, still substantial, now exceeded the value the houses provided. The mansions became liabilities. And across the country, families made the same calculation. The cost was too high, the benefit too low. Sell, donate, demolish. The attic floors, built at minimal cost, outlasted the marble and silk in many cases. Some mansions were torn down, but the attic infrastructure, cheap and durable, sometimes survived in fragments. At other sites, the servant quarters remain intact while the grand public rooms deteriorate. The hierarchy inverted. What was valued least now persists longest. The cost written in brick was not just financial, it was human. The attic rooms housed 2,287 servants in Newport alone in 1895. Across 60 years, tens of thousands of people climbed those narrow stairs, slept in those small rooms, and made beauty possible for families who rarely acknowledge their existence. The wages they earned, the hours they worked, the conditions they endured, all of it was calculated in ledgers and forgotten. But the rooms remain, and the rooms remember. Chapter 12. Beauty built on proximity. The grandest homes in America were never empty shells, but layered worlds stacked one above another. Stand in the great hall of the breakers today and look up. The ceiling soars 2.5 stories overhead, painted in trompe-l'oeil clouds and allegorical figures. Light pours through arched windows. The stone columns feel ancient, as if they were quarried from a Roman temple rather than carved in a Connecticut workshop. The space is designed to awe, and it succeeds. 400,000 visitors per year walk through this room and feel small beneath its scale. Now imagine standing in the attic, directly above. The ceiling drops to 7 feet. The windows shrink to narrow dormers. The floor is bare wood, the walls plain plaster. The contrast is absolute. One world celebrates beauty, the other world sustains it. And between them, just 12 inches of wood and plaster. This proximity was the deepest paradox of Gilded Age architecture. The families and servants lived in the same house, slept on adjacent floors, shared the same roof. They were closer to each other than most neighbors in a modern suburb. Yet socially, the distance was unbridgeable. The architecture enforced separation, even as it mandated proximity. Back stairs, service corridors, hidden doors, all of it was designed to keep the worlds apart while keeping them adjacent. The system worked because everyone understood their role. The servants knew they were invisible. The families knew the servants were essential. The balance depended on silence and acceptance. When the servants began to question the system in the 1910s and 20s, when they found alternatives and left for factory jobs, the balance collapsed. The proximity remained, but the social contract fractured. What does this history reveal about ambition and inequality? The Vanderbilts were not cruel. They were not unusual. They built houses that reflected the values of their time. Wealth was meant to be displayed. Labor was meant to be abundant and cheap. The architecture expressed this worldview in stone and wood. It stacked comfort downward and hardship upward. It placed beauty on display and suffering out of sight. But the architecture also preserved the evidence. The attic rooms remain. The back staircases persist. The service corridors still connect the basement kitchens to the upstairs bedrooms. And anyone willing to climb those stairs and stand in those narrow rooms can feel the disparity. The houses were designed to hide this reality, but the hiding place survives. The attic floors, closed off and ignored for decades, are the most honest part of these mansions. They show what the marble and silk conceal. In 1895, 2,287 servants lived in Newport attic rooms. They woke before dawn. They hauled coal and water. They scrubbed floors and polished silver. They emptied chamber pots and made beds. They worked 16-hour days, 6 days a week, 52 weeks a year. They did this for wages that barely exceeded the national median income, in rooms that were hot in summer and cold in winter, under strict rules that governed their behavior and appearance. They were essential, invisible, and unacknowledged. By 1940, those attic rooms were empty. The system that sustained them had collapsed under economic pressure and social change. The servants found better options. The families could not replace them. The houses, built for an army of workers, became impractical with skeleton staffs. Some were demolished, others were donated. A few survived as museums, their public rooms restored to Gilded Age splendor, while the attic floors remained closed. Does beauty lose its shine once we see the labor that made it possible? The question assumes beauty and labor are separate. They are not. The beauty of the breakers is inseparable from the labor that sustained it. The polished marble floors were beautiful because someone polished them. The gleaming silver was beautiful because someone polished it. The fresh flowers in the dining room were beautiful because someone arranged them. The beauty was not inherent, it was produced daily. But understanding the full context deepens the experience. The music room is still stunning. The craftsmanship is still remarkable. But understanding the full context deepens the experience. The houses become more complex, more human, more real. They are not just monuments to wealth. They are records of a system that stacked people vertically, divided them socially, and depended on silence to function. The attic floors are the key to this understanding. They are the proof that grandeur was not effortless. They are the evidence that wealth required infrastructure. They are the memorial to 2,287 servants whose names we will never know, whose voices we will never hear, whose lives are preserved only in census records and payroll ledgers and the narrow rooms where they slept. Truth does not erase beauty. It contextualizes it. And the truth written in the architecture of the breakers and the Vanderbilt Chateau and every other Gilded Age mansion is this: beauty was built on proximity. The families lived in luxury precisely because servants lived in hardship directly above them. The distance between the worlds was measured in floors, not miles. The separation was social, not physical. And the architecture that enforced this separation, the attic rooms and back stairs and service corridors, it survives as the most honest testimony to how wealth actually functioned. The grandest homes in America were never empty shells. They were layered worlds stacked vertically, maintained through constant labor, and designed to hide that labor from anyone who mattered. The attic army served for 60 years, 2,287 strong in Newport alone at its peak. They climbed the narrow stairs every morning. They descended them every night. They lived above the silk and below the sky, visible to each other, but invisible to history. Until now, the rooms remain, the stairs persist, and slowly, reluctantly, museums are beginning to tell the full story. Not just the story of the families who built these houses, but the story of the people who made them livable. Not just the beauty of the marble and silk, but the cost of the coal and scrubbing. Not just the grandeur of the Great Hall, but the cramped reality of the attic rooms above it. The architecture tells the truth if we are willing to climb the back stairs and see it. The attic floors are not footnotes, they are the foundation. And understanding that foundation changes how we see everything built on top of it. Beauty endures, but so does memory. And the memory embedded in those narrow attic rooms, in the worn wooden stairs, in the small dormer windows overlooking the ocean, is clear. Grandeur was never effortless. It was built, sustained, and maintained by people whose labor we have spent a century trying to forget. The attic army is gone, but the rooms remain, and the rooms remember everything.